This week, we will be delving deeper into contemporary shifts in LGBTQ cultures in Canada and the US. So, a lot of the analysis will focus on RuPaul's Drag Race itself, in addition to looking at larger trends of gentrification, assimilation, and neoliberalism as they impact LGBTQ neighborhoods and enclaves. So, we're thinking about media spaces and physical spaces and the ways in which certain structures of what we call late stage capitalism have impacted the LGBTQ community or communities. In the title, I highlighted Drag Race to motion that we're talking about RuPaul's Drag Race, but also that we want to highlight the role that race and racism play in movements that we can call homonormative. So where there's this development of um, uh, an LGBTQ person, usually someone who is cisgender, usually someone who's white, who has access to resources like income, ability to have leisure time, that has been centered in a lot of capitalist trends in the past 20 years. And so we'll be thinking about who's included within those pushes to normativity and who's excluded. So here are the readings for this week. The main reading looks at the language of nationalism as used in RuPaul's Drag Race. So the idea of an American identity and the relationship between this myth of the American dream and success on Drag Race. The group readings for this week look specifically at physical spaces. So we've talked a lot about the gay bar as a public, social, political institution, wherein which drag as a form of community art and gender performance has flourished. So we'll be thinking about the ways that the kind of tide of LGBTQ activism and civil rights changes for LGBTQ people since the 1970s after the gay liberation movement has really changed the ways that queer space is produced, changes how people access it, changes notions of belonging. So we can think about how changes to sexual and gendered urban landscapes have really also reshaped the ways that people will access things like gay bars, things like queer public institutions. So we'll be thinking about the relationship between place and broader ideas of gender and gender performance. We will also be thinking about the ways that movements of gentrification and assimilation of certain members of LGBTQ cultures has really shaped what we can call gay, lesbian, or trans or LGBTQ neighborhoods. So we looked at how uh, historically LGBTQ people will kind of come together at in particular enclaves. So enclaves were more underground. They wouldn't appear on a map. It would be places where just larger groups of queer people would live. And so this, of course, changes after the gay liberation movement when there is more public and visible space that queer people are accessing. People are starting to be counted as a demographic, and this change from enclaves and more underground spaces that were um, heavily policed, were heavily under the scrutiny of the state, of local officials, often being raided by vice, so-called vice squads. For example, the Stonewall riots is a prime example of that. So we'll be thinking about the ways that queer space has changed, has been reformed in the past 30 years as influenced by gentrification in cities and the kind of dispersal of certain queer communities within a city outside of these so-called neighborhoods. The Matson article specifically looks at gay nightlife, so kind of a closer look at the gay bar as an institution, And the ways that homonormativity, which we will define later in the lecture, has reshaped placemaking in San Francisco. So when we think of placemaking, we can think about how a particular space that might be named as queer, that is known as queer, is formed. Who can access it? Who has access to the resources to be able to actually buy or to rent an actual physical space in a city like San Francisco, which has experienced waves of gentrification in the past 30 years, largely due to the impact of Silicon Valley. So, of course, these kinds of movements were in which rent and inflation and other economic changes prohibit certain people from being able to access these uh, forms of so-called gay nightlife or queer space. And finally, the last article looks at the creation of lesbian communities and how the influence of queer space has reformed the ways that lesbian or queer women take up space in Montreal specifically. So the Podmore article really addresses a lot of contemporary debates within geographies of sexuality and gender that look at and try to trace the ways that different members of queer communities um, participate in placemaking, access space, create neighborhoods, etc. So, how did we get from gay liberation to this contemporary historical moment where pride parades are public, visible events attended by people of all different walks of life? And we'll often see within different cities that there will be more local or kind of neighborhood based pride adjacent events that kind of eschew the embracing of capitalism of large companies. But for any of us who have been to one of these larger pride parades, such as that used to be held in Vancouver before coronavirus, obviously, on Davie Street, things like World Pride, larger prides like San Francisco, New York, Toronto, Montreal, all of them share this relationship to capitalism and to corporations. And so we will be talking a bit about how that kind of slow acceptance into larger capitalist models um, has changed the ways in which queer people are seen by outside the community and also within, and how this contributes to a single axis idea of queerness, where queerness becomes coded as white, becomes coded often as in relationship to a white gay male culture. And then we'll see things like in Vancouver, where you have the Dyke March, which starts on Commercial Drive and is firmly anti-capitalist. Then the Trans March, which is also on Commercial Drive, which is also is additionally firmly anti-capitalist. So we'll talk a bit about those different political stances, arguments that think through the ways that this kind of integration into capitalist structures, the kind of creation of a gay demographic, has impacted, for better or for worse, queer cultures in the West. But then also, what are what are the forms of dissent and critique that are happening in relationship to this larger cultural trend of pride as being this mass, um, rainbow colored um, coming together of both people and businesses and corporations, many of whom even 20, 30 years ago um, are likely to not have been interested in so-called embracing, the LGBTQ community, um, not necessarily in the sense around the political position of, or tolerance, which isn't always obvious, but as a means to make or to be denied income. So how did we get from this to this? Here we see representations, just a few examples of representations of contemporary pride or queer or LGBTQ um, folks and pride communities, and even kind of a slow embracing of transness. So we'll see, similar to homonormativity, slowly there are moments where we see transnormativity. It's very different from homonormativity insofar as gender difference is still it is kind of met with a form of scrutiny and anxiety that isn't always necessarily approached, that isn't always necessarily used to understand sexuality. So these are different experiences. However, if it is trending, if a company sees that there is business to be made, there is more of an impetus to even rhetorically embrace trans communities. So um, we could perhaps think through this particular ad that some people are trans, get over it, which mirrors the kind of older campaign of some women marry women, some men marry men, get over it. And it would be interesting to see if there's anything beyond this rhetoric. Is this just use of a more contemporary identity politic to make money? Does any of this campaign go towards trans community? So these are the kinds of questions we need to be asking as we try to navigate the more contemporary media landscape. For instance, we see this Time cover with a former presidential candidate, Pete Buttigieg, and his husband, um, and calling them the first family. So obviously, Pete Buttigieg is publicly out, you know, proudly gay, talks about his husband a lot, didn't shy away from that. But when he also talks about his experience in the military and has a political positionality which is more moderate than some of the other candidates were. So we need to think about the ways that forms of liberalism have impacted queer culture and who's allowed to kind of rise in the ranks to be in the position, for example, to run for president. And so be thinking about the ways that whiteness and class also really shape this trajectory. The plan for this week will focus on the following kind of concepts. So we'll be looking at drag race and capitalism. So things like branding, which we talked a bit about last week, modes of consumption. So thinking about gay people as a demographic, as a market that can be kind of identified and sold to, that has buying power. We think about economic mobility and the ways that access to certain resources in capitalism allows certain queer people to do things and kind of also prohibit other queer people from being able to access forms of privilege within the modern state. So, thinking about those structures as they also impact queer and, of course, drag subcultures, because drag cultures are firmly immersed in queer community, as we've talked about. We'll be thinking through these really important terms, these kind of ideas that are situated within this critical analysis in academia that we can use to think through these larger trends. So, homonormativity, gay liberalism, and things like assimilation. And finally, we'll be looking at this term homo nationalism and the ways that American and Canadian national identities come up on RuPaul's Drag Race and the adjacent shows. So, for instance, Canada's Drag Race and America's Drag Race, how the kind of use of American symbols, Americanism as an identity, and kind of embrace of forms of institutions that are more normative, like the military, how they play out on RuPaul's Drag Race, and what that tells us about the ways that modern, we can even say gay culture, although of course that's limited, particularly the modern mainstream pride movements, um, are related to national identities. So being Canadian or being American as representing a form of freedom, as standing in for this idea that these places are inherently queer positive, without really looking through the ways that um, America and Canada, as settler colonial states, as imperialist states, have participated and still continue to participate in forms of homophobia, structural homophobia, transphobia, etc. Next week, or rather, sorry, this week on Friday, we'll be looking at more exam review. So I prepared some example answers from the exam that I held in the summer to kind of give you a sense of what an A answer looks like. So just kind of make sure everyone comes to class on Friday, and I will kind of help you think through some of the tricks that might help you get a better grade on the exam.